So thank you so much for your patience. This is our first hybrid event that we've done in a long time in this room. So actually, it's our first event that we've done in this room ever. So thank you so much for your patience. Thank you to everyone who came out in person. It's really great to see so many people here in the room. And we have about 100 people online as well, which is fantastic. So thank you everyone for joining us online. This is the American Jewish Experience in Medicine program. It's made possible by Dr. Helen Morris. So thank you so much, Dr. Helen Morris. She is here today in the room, and hopefully she'll share some of her thoughts with us before the program ends. So just a few quick housekeeping items. We do have the Q&A button. We encourage you to use that. If you have any questions or comments for the speakers, we will open it up to audience participation. Thank you as well for those of you who sent questions in advance. We have those as well. This program is being recorded, so if you need to jump off early, we will send out the link to that video. So thank you to our speakers for giving us permission for that. We'll post it to our website, coloradobioethics.org, under past events within 5 business days. So with that, I'll introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Matt Wynia. Dr. Wynia is the director of the Center for Bioethics and Humanities and also a professor of medicine at the School of Medicine. So thank you, Dr. Wynia.
Thank you so much, Millie, and it is lovely to be with you virtually. As many of you know, I really sincerely was hoping I'd be able to be there today in person, but I am still recovering from a COVID rebound case. So instead, I come to you from my basement. And it's my pleasure to facilitate this conversation today with Dr. Paul Root Wolpe, Rabbi Dr. Jason Weiner, and Dr. Jeremy Lazarus. And I'll do brief introductions of the 3 of them. We will put their a little bit more comprehensive bio sketches directly into the chat. And I'll start with Dr. Paul Wolpe. Paul is the Skenazy Distinguished Professor of Jewish Bioethics and Director of the Center for Ethics at Emory University. An old friend. Paul and I succeeded each other as president of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities. And he is more illustrious than I. He has actually been profiled in the Science Times of the New York Times, something all of us eventually aspire to. Rabbi Dr. Jason Weiner serves as the senior rabbi and is director of the spiritual care department at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles. He will be commenting on Dr. Wolpe's presentation. He has a master's degree in bioethics and in health policy and a master's degree in Jewish history. And he's the author of The Jewish Guide to Practical Medical Decision-Making and also a book on observance of Jewish law in the hospital. So extremely well qualified to bring the messages of Dr. Wolpe sort of to the clinical setting. And finally, Dr. Jeremy Lazarus, also an old friend. Jerry is a psychiatrist here in Colorado. He was the 167th president of the American Medical Association, and he currently serves on the AMA's Council on Ethical and Judicial Affairs. So also extremely well qualified to bring Paul's comments sort of to the real world in a policy arena. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Paul for a presentation that I'm really looking forward to on what essentially everyone ought to know about Jewish bioethics. I have fondly started thinking of this program as Jewish bioethics for non-Jews. That's because I'm a non-Jew, I suppose. But I'm very excited to introduce and to hear and learn from Paul Root Wolpe.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. Hello, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here. This is my 3rd or 4th time on this campus, and I always marvel at it. It seems to grow bigger every time I come. Glad you have a lot of extra space to expand. I changed the title a little bit on the slide than what is in your book because I wanted to make a point with the title. And the first few words, "you shall surely heal," is a bad translation of the Hebrew, "Yerapo Yerapeh," which is in Exodus and Shemot. And in Jewish thought, whenever a word or its root is repeated twice, it is a particular emphasis. And that word in Hebrew, the fundamentals of which is healing, is repeated twice in that phrase, which has always been interpreted as a strong mandate in Judaism to heal and to participate in the medical world. So Jews have always been very, very active in medicine. What I'd like to do today, if I can get these slides to advance, which they're not doing right now, just one sec, there we go. The topics to be covered are, what do we mean by Jewish bioethics? I'm going to give a quick sort of overview of at least my quirky definition of it, or my way I look at it. Just a word on Jewish influence on science and bioethics and why. Some Jewish approaches to how we think about bioethical issues. I'm going to talk about 2 examples, and then hopefully in Q&A we can talk about many more, and then a few final thoughts. So what do we mean by Jewish bioethics? We kind of mean 2 very different things. On the one hand, we mean a way to make ethical decisions around medicine and the life sciences, by the way, using a series of techniques and resources that I'll talk about in a second, and that these are defensible decisions, not just that you made them, but you can explain how and why and from what sources you made those decisions in bioethical situations. This way of thinking about medicine in Judaism goes back thousands of years, and the fundamentals of it in some ways haven't changed in those thousands of years. It's based on Jewish law, on halakha, but it's also based on the contributions that have been made by surrounding societies throughout Jewish history. So there is a historical and contextual element to Jewish tradition. And importantly, as halakha, as law, it only has sort of authoritative power over Jews who accept its authority. So as we'll see in a few minutes, there are lots of Jews who don't. Even if one doesn't accept the authoritative power of halakha, this 2,500-year-old conversation made by some of the best and brightest of Jewish history contributes a set of overarching values in some ways separate from halakha that themselves has helped influence non-Jewish ways of thinking about medicine in the cultures in which Jews have been embedded. And that's true not just today, it's true throughout a large part of Jewish history. But perhaps there is a difference that is often misunderstood between Jewish bioethics and the bioethics of Jews. And by that, I mean this. Imagine that you were a practitioner out in rural Oklahoma somewhere, never met a Jew in your life, and you were going to be reassigned to, Williamsburg or Borough Park or someplace anywhere in New York. And you realize, boy, I'm going to have a lot of Jewish patients. I should read up on Jewish medicine so that I can see what kinds of things to expect. And you read especially the halachic Jewish bioethics literature, you would be deeply ill prepared for a large percentage of the Jews you would encounter. And that's because how Jews behave and think about these issues, and by Jews here I mean across the spectrum from Orthodox to secular, is often at odds with what one might expect from the way halakha thinks about these issues. And I'm going to show that to you over and over again. And by the bioethics of Jews, we also mean something social. And that is the presence of Jewish thought, as I'll also show you, oversampled by dramatically in medicine, life science, and science in general. That is, the percentage of Jews that have contributed significantly to medicine and science is far disproportionate to the number of Jews actually in society. So we're going to talk about both of these 2 elements of Jewish bioethics as we move through. So first, I want to point something out. Usually when people like me point this out, it sounds like we're trying to make some point about, how accomplished Jews are, but that's not my point here at all. Point is very different. 23% of all Nobel Prizes have been won by Jews, which is 11,250% above Jewish actual representation internationally. And it's only 0.2% internationally and 1.8% in the United States. At least 18 of the 100 scientists who shaped the world history, which is itself a well-recognized sort of compendium of the greatest scientists, are Jewish. And that's just the ones we can identify. And 3 of the top 6 that this list identifies as the greatest scientists in history are Jewish. Jews have won 38% of all National Medal of Science awards, 38%. That's astonishing if you think about it, in a country in which we're 1.8% of the population. So 4 presidents have had bioethics advisory commissions on both sides of the aisle. Yet all 4 presidents chose Jews to chair those. And in one case, the Jew stepped down and a Catholic bioethicist replaced it. And that's really important because over and over again, if it isn't Jews, it's Catholics. And I think there's a reason for that. I think the wisdom of thousands of years of thinking about this, a little longer for the Jews, but plenty long for Catholics, has created a kind of understanding that there's a wisdom there that allows people to have confidence in people who come from those traditions, that they have a resource that is thought seriously and long about these kinds of issues. Of the 17, Matt just mentioned that he and I were both presidents of the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities. Well, of the 17 so far, at least 9 have been Jewish and 3 Catholic. Of the 7, so there's also an association of bioethics program directors. This is everybody in the country who runs a bioethics program, like Matt and myself. And of the 7 presidents, of which I was one, 4 have been Jewish. And then finally, if you look at the top bioethics centers throughout the United States, again, a great disproportion of Jews are there. And I say this not to say anything other than how powerful the Jewish presence is in this conversation. That even Jews that aren't themselves particularly knowledgeable or trained or educated in Jewish ways of thinking, were kind of pickled in that brine, and so bring that perspective to it, even sometimes not realizing that they're bringing that perspective to it. I've seen that over and over again. All right, so I hope I've made the point that the Jewish contribution to this conversation is powerful, even though the numbers of Jews in the country is relatively modest. So how do we, sorry about the way this is being obscured by the top of the screen, but I hope you can read it anyway. So now that we've talked about the fact that Jews bring a lot to this conversation, what is in fact the conversation that Jews have about this? So there are a number of different ways I want us to think about this that we'll talk about as we go through. First, the halachic approach. This is the traditional Jewish approach in which rabbis generally are arguing about some kind of decision about some issue. They engage in arguments that use existing Jewish texts as proof texts. When you make a claim, you don't just make the claim because it's smart or clever or seems right. You have to back it up with a text. And then finally, there is a decision made. And this way of training then is taught to rabbis, especially Orthodox rabbis, who then become the deciders of these kinds of issues for their own congregations, for example. We also have a rich legacy of Jewish texts and cases outside of the pure halakha, including the halakha conversation and outside of the halakha conversation that Jews draw from. Jews have a Talmudic way of thinking and analyzing things, even when they're not particularly realizing that they're doing it, even when they're thinking about things that aren't particularly Jewish. It's kind of ingrained in the Jewish way of thinking. The Jewish Talmudic conversation is casuistic, and that means it uses cases as its basis, and then principles are applied to or derived from cases. So it's a case-based way of thinking. And there's also a particular style of debating and adjudicating these issues. Another really important thing, and the way in which this fits in with halakha, sometimes a little bit in tension, is that Jews have a historical experience, especially around issues of genetics, which some other time you'll invite me back and I'll talk about genetics. I'm not going to talk about genetics today unless you ask about it. But post-Holocaust in particular, Jews have become very sensitive to the kinds of medical justifications that Matt is an expert in himself and brings to Denver as well as to the world, that were operative in the Shoah. And then we think about these and we talk about these issues and have for thousands of years. So we bring that wisdom as well. So these are the kinds of ways that that this roils in the Jewish imagination. And all of these contribute in one way or another to the Jewish conversation that hopefully Jews bring and then take in conversation with people from other faith traditions and from secular traditions. Then within Judaism, there are a couple of primary sort of camps that have different approaches. First, again, is the sort of Orthodox camp that uses this traditional methodology, that within the Torah, within the given word, is somehow all the answers. If you can be clever enough to use the proof text there as inspiration for answers. Interpretation of text is central to thinking about this. Ethics is not special. One of the interesting things, ethics pervades the Hebrew Bible, and yet it is nowhere in the Hebrew Bible. And by that, I mean the idea of ethics as a separate category of thought came out of Greece, not out of the Hebrew Bible. In fact, there is no Hebrew word for ethics the way we think about it in traditional Judaism. And in Hebrew today, it's usually just called etika. Because those kinds of decisions that we now think of as ethical in the Hebrew Bible are integrated into all religiously obligated decisions that you need to make. And they aren't separated out as a special category. Then there's sort of a middle tradition, and this is some people, what we might say on the left of Orthodoxy and the right of progressive Judaism or conservative Judaism, that still sees halakha as authoritative, but gives a lot more space to contemporary ideas, to social context, to historical context, and may come up with some decisions that pure halakhic scholars might not think are right or appropriate. And then finally, the progressive arm of Reform and Reconstructionist Judaism that have released halakha's authority over them. That is, they don't believe that this ancient tradition anymore binds modern behavior. It's an inspiration, and its values that are derived from it inspire the way one should behave. And it is only one contributor to what it should be thought of as general Jewish values from which one makes decisions, but the halakha itself is not authoritative anymore. So these are really kind of a spectrum. It isn't three separate ways of thinking. It's a continuum into which groups and individuals tend to put themselves. So I wanted to say all this for those of you who aren't really that familiar with, and this is all an oversimplification, as all generalizations are, but I think it gives you a flavor of some of the conversations that happen within Judaism too, where people from these different camps have conversations with each other and between each other, and often disagree with each other. Disagreement, debate is a core value of Jewish thinking. So let's take an example. I'm going to start with abortion, and the reason that I decided to talk about abortion is because last weekend I was at something called Limud, which is an international movement of Jewish learning. It's a weekend. We went away to a camp in northern Georgia, and I moderated a panel on Jewish views of abortion with two rabbis and an OBGYN, and there were also other rabbis and lawyers who work on this in the audience. It was a very well-attended and robust conversation. So I've been thinking about these issues all week. I just want to show the interesting ways in which all the things I've just talked about manifest themselves in real issues in Jewish life and then contribute to popular life. In traditional halakhic thinking, abortion is permissible under certain very restricted situations. And they involve threats of health to the mother. So this fetus, either in its existence in the womb or through the possibility of delivery, is going to threaten the health of the mother. In those cases, if carefully examined and then permitted by an authority, abortion is not only permitted, but in some cases mandated. And that's very important. It's mandated. If the life of the woman is threatened by the fetus, abortion is mandated. That'll become important in a minute. But what it does not do is traditionally is allow abortion on demand. The prerequisite has to be some threat to the mother. And that's very clear here. Just a few examples. Daniel Eisenberg, who writes a lot about Jewish bioethics, as a general rule, abortion in Judaism is permitted only if there's a direct threat to the life of the mother. Moshe Feinstein, who was one of the great poskim, one of the great people who Jews recognize have the authority to make definitive decisions about the nature of halakha, says Torah observant physicians are forbidden to participate in any way in an abortion. I add on demand because that's what he's talking about. He certainly accepts the idea that abortion is acceptable if the life of the mother is threatened. Whether the patient is Jewish or non-Jewish. So a Jewish physician can't even participate in the abortion of a non-Jewish woman. The prohibition against abortion on demand is a universal prohibition in Rabbi Feinstein's view. Elliot Dorff is conservative, but he's the halachic end of the conservative spectrum. Jewish law restricts the legitimacy of abortion to a narrow range of cases. It does not give blanket permission to abort. So this is a very clear statement from what we might think of the right side of this way of thinking about Judaism. Very clear. A woman's life or health has to be at some risk. By the way, progressive Jews have said there are principles behind all this, and they've taken them further or differently. So it is also true that in Jewish thought, Judaism does not believe that life begins at conception. It's very different than a Catholic view. This is one of those, when people talk about the Judeo-Christian way of thinking, this is one of the places where Jews say that doesn't really mean anything, because it isn't Judeo-Christian. We Jews think very differently than Christians do about certain things, and this is one of them. So the Talmud says that the embryo is considered to be mere fluid until the 40th day, until the quickening. So keep that in mind for a second. And then a second principle, there have been interpretations of parts of the Bible, such as the one where two men are fighting and strike a woman who's pregnant and cause a miscarriage, that can be interpreted to suggest that the Bible does not consider a fetus to be a full human being in the sense that is being argued right now by some people. So what does that lead to? Why is that important? Here, for example, is the statement on abortion by the National Council of Jewish Women. NCJW works to ensure, I'm reading the bold, that every single person can make their own moral and faith decisions about their body, health, and future. Our Jewish values compel us to support full access to safe and legal abortion. Below is a Q&A regarding some of the common misconceptions. So, does Jewish law state that life begins at conception? No, that's true. But notice that what they're now doing is leveraging that idea as a value to actually go beyond what halachic Judaism would say and say, because it doesn't suggest that life begins at conception. Therefore, we want to broaden this idea of the permissibility of abortion, especially early in pregnancy. Or the second example here, does Jewish law assert that it's possible to murder a fetus? No, Jewish law does not consider a fetus to be alive. That's incorrect. Jewish law does consider a fetus to be living, but so is your liver. Right? That does not mean that, it does not consider the fetus to have the rights of a full human being. So I think this is bad phrasing on their part. But what they're trying to say is, look at these Jewish ideas. Therefore, we believe that abortion should be freely accessible, etc., which is far beyond what halachic Judaism would say about it. Why is this important? This is important because, oh, and one more thing before I get to that. So the health or the life of the woman is paramount when we consider abortion. But what does that really mean? So when I had this panel, a conversation on abortion last week, and a conversation ensued by what do we mean by the health of the mother? And there's a spectrum of ideas about that. Certainly her physical health, everyone agrees. Certainly her mental health, though interpreting that can be disputed. But what about her psychological health? In other words, mental health in this particular moment, meaning mental illness. Psychological health, meaning psychological well-being. How far do we allow the woman's desire not to be pregnant right now and how it might disrupt her life and her feelings and her maybe sadness about it? How far do we go to call that the health of the mother is up to great interpretation. And even within the Orthodox community, there can be differences about where we draw that line. But certainly as you get outside the Orthodox community, that has been interpreted extremely liberally. And perhaps to some people on the Orthodox side, much too liberally. And that is why, and so that's kind of interpretive stuff, the bioethic, the Jewish bioethic. But what about that other thing I said, the bioethics of Jews? Well, to show sometimes the powerful difference between this way of thinking and lived reality of Jews, here is a study by Pew of religious attitudes towards abortion. The most liberal group towards abortion in the United States by far is Jews, with only 14% suggesting that it should be illegal in any way. And there are a couple of ways to interpret this. This doesn't necessarily mean that people are rejecting the halachic view because this is about illegality, not permissibility. But it certainly says something about the fact that the lived experience of Jews seems somehow to be slightly disconnected from at least a purely halachic view. And that's why I say, if you were that practitioner in Oklahoma about to move to New York City and you wanted to understand the Jewish attitude towards abortion and you read only that halachically it's only for the health and safety of the mother, you wouldn't understand this. You would come in there not understanding that the attitude of Jews themselves is the most liberal in the United States towards abortion of any religious population, right? That's where sometimes the Jewish bioethics and the bioethics of Jews has a disconnect. Excuse me 1 second. Okay. Now, as some of you know, there's been a lawsuit in Florida by a Jewish group arguing that Florida's law restricting abortion denies Jews their religious mandate. Remember, not just permission, but mandate to engage in abortion when the life or health of the mother is at risk. It's a very interesting political issue that we don't have time to talk about. It's not only being used by Jews, it's being used by Christians too, to say that laws in the United States are violating their religious right to do X. Okay? And this will be a very interesting case to watch as we move forward. So that's an example of abortion, for example, as a way in which there's an extremely complicated set of dynamics happening around Jewish bioethics from the most sort of traditional down to the most progressive, and the way that ends up being translated into Jewish behavior in society as a whole. Now let's talk briefly about COVID. So Jews were very involved in the COVID conversation on both the medical side. Physicians who were involved in the COVID conversation had a large Jewish representation, and on the ethics side. In fact, a friend of mine, Marty Cetrin, is the head of quarantine. He just retired last month, but during COVID, he was the head of quarantine in the United States. Marty decided which ships could and could not come into the United States. Marty decided immigration policy about who could and couldn't come into the country, and included trade and everything else. And we discussed it. And in fact, we discussed Jewish views of that together as well. So in an indirect way, that way of thinking had a profound impact on the US's policies around quarantine. I'm not saying that Marty brought Jewish bioethics to quarantine and made the decisions based on Jewish bioethics. I'm simply saying that he's someone who knows that those issues, has thought about those issues, and so they fertilized his way of thinking about these kinds of things. One of the things that happened when COVID first reared its head, that both Dr. Wynia and I were both involved in, was the medical community turned to the bioethics community and said, we don't know what to do. We are expecting the possibility, it never manifested itself in most places, but there was a real fear of this at the beginning, that COVID would be so disabling that there would be people coming to the emergency rooms and coming to the hospitals, and hospitals would not have enough ventilators, for example, for all the patients that were going to show up. So they were going to need to decide which patient got it and which patient didn't, and how are they supposed to do that? Doctors are not themselves, doctors make decisions based on medical necessity. And when you have a large group of people with medical necessity and a scarce resource, doctors not only aren't trained to, but they don't like to make the decision on who should get what. It should be a broader social conversation, and they're right about that. And so Matt and I and many other bioethics leaders in the United States thought about this, wrote these 2 articles. For those of you on Zoom, you can't see my laser pointer, but you'll see Matt and I are both co-authors of both of these journal articles on ventilator triage and ethical issues in COVID-19. And notice there are a lot of authors of these, many of whom happen to be Jewish. But the point is, this conversation went on about how we should do this. And there were issues here in which Jewish thought and secular thought, Jewish thought, and what we might think of as the rest of sort of secular / Christian thought differed. And I'll give you an example. How might Jewish thought differ from secular thought on this issue? Imagine that you're in a hospital and you have a person on a ventilator, and that person is in the assessment of physicians not going to make it. Ventilator or no ventilator, this person is going to die. And then someone comes into the emergency room who is not as sick and could benefit from that ventilator. Is it okay to remove that ventilator from the person who's dying and give it to the person who has a chance? And if you talk to people about this in sort of the normal, which I have often, in sort of the normal non-experts, average people, they will say, yes, I think that's perfectly okay. I mean, after all, this person really isn't going to benefit from it while the other person's life may be saved. But in fact, in Jewish thought, perhaps not. And some would say definitely not. Why not? Because we have a concept. It's called the goses. And the goses is a person who is imminently dying. Within 24 hours of death was the original concept, but with medical care and things that can be stretched out to a longer period. And there's very clear rules about what you can and cannot do to the goses, to the person who is in sort of that very, very last stage of life. So for example, the text says the goses is considered living in every regard. You cannot consider this person as about to die. That's a non-living category. This is a living person. One does not bind his jaw or stop up his orifice or place upon him a metal plate or anything. Remember, this was written thousands of years ago, so these are things that aren't relevant to us. It's the principle. Or anything that would chill his torso until the moment of his death. One does not move him or wash him nor place him on sand or salt until the moment of his death. One does not close his eyes with the fingers. One who touches or moves him is guilty of murder. Reb Meir would liken him to a flickering candle. Should anyone touch it, it will go out immediately. Thus it is when one closes the eyes of the dying patient. We consider it as if he takes his life. So there's a very clear mandate here about how you treat someone about to die. And clearly pulling a ventilator out of that person violates this principle, right? And so one might argue that the Jewish perspective here, now understand that there are other ways to argue this, and some Jews arguing this might find ways and reasons to remove that ventilator. But I want to make it clear that this is a very good, this and other sources like it are a good platform from which to argue. Judaism would say, no, you cannot take the ventilator off a person until they are dead. And and it's tragic that this other person could benefit from it and there isn't another ventilator, but your moral obligation is actually to make sure there are enough ventilators, not to kill a person, not to kill the ghosts by removing the ventilator from him or her. So that's a very different perspective. Now, I'm not saying that because of that, the US policy or a state policy, because it was all about states, not about the country as a whole, should be that. But I'm saying for Jewish spokesmen in this big conversation we had with 80 or so bioethics directors, to bring this perspective and teach it influences the conversation. And maybe the decision ends up being the policy that we have in secular institutions in our country is, yes, you do remove the ventilator. Very possible that that could be the policy. But the Jewish perspective can be influential in the conversation and also can point out what the problems are for something that to most people originally looks unproblematic. So when you talk to the average person, they go, of course you take it out. The other person needs it and this person can't benefit from it anymore. So it isn't a question we need to morally examine. And what happens in cases like this, we say, wait, we need to morally examine it. Maybe we'll come up with that decision, but it isn't just a no-brainer. So, finally, I want to say a word about the Orthodox community. Some of you may have read that there were Orthodox communities who did not comply with CDC recommendations. They resisted masking, they resisted social distancing. And at first, one could, and now we're moving to a different kind of bioethics of Jews rather than Jewish bioethics. And that is one could see that as being resistant, as being recalcitrant, as being somehow, cultish. There were a lot of these things being thrown around at the time in the press, and by the way, in private conversations amongst Jews and non-Jews as well. But what are the values of the community that led them to be that way, to feel that way? And studies of Orthodox communities have shown that their single highest value is the value of community and a sense of belonging, of being an integrated group whose interactions are in some profound and deep and valued way part of the reason for living together in an Orthodox community to begin with. And so whenever we see people resisting these kinds of things, we have to ask, what are the value conflicts? The single most important thing I have learned in 40 years of doing ethics is this. We're taught that ethics is about right and wrong. How you decide between what's right and what's wrong. And it rarely is. It is when you're a kid, don't steal the candy, don't hit your sister. We learn all those basic ethical rules. But if you look back at the ethical issues you've had as an adult in your life, you will see that in every case, I'm willing to say, except maybe rare cases, it's not about a right and a wrong. It's about two positive values in conflict, two right things in conflict. Health and safety versus community solidarity. Most communities in the United States went for health and safety. The Orthodox community went for community solidarity. You may think that's wrong. You may think that's the wrong decision, but it isn't a flippant decision. It's a value clash, and all ethical issues are about value clashes. I've been teaching medical students for 40 years, and you say to them, you have a patient who wants to do something you don't think is in their best interest, and you have your obligation to do what's in the best interest of patients. What do? That's not a right and a wrong. It's two important values, patient autonomy, physician beneficence, and both of them can't be honored. So most ethical issues are about two or more values in conflict. And if we really want to understand, it's easy to condemn other groups when their values don't conform with yours. But that's what it's all about. All of politics is about that. Individual liberty or community responsibility. Right? I mean, we can talk about that a lot. So some concluding thoughts, and then we can have some conversation. Jewish contributions to medicine have persisted for thousands of years. Judaism is not a monolith. You could read something about Jewish bioethics, and I guarantee you that whatever you're reading about Jewish bioethics, there are people even within that community, whatever community that comes from, who dispute and argue and debate it. That's the Jewish way of thinking. Jewish religious structure and history encourages science, medicine, and ethics. No surprise that Jews are oversampled in both medicine and bioethics. Jews have been talking about medicine and been very pro-medicine and science for thousands of years. And of course, ethics is integral to the Jewish way of thinking, so integral that we don't even have a word for it, which you might think means that it's not integral. But what it means is that it's fully integrated through all the ways Jews think about things. So I believe that Jewish wisdom has and can continue to contribute to modern bioethical debates. I invite you in our Q&A to ask about anything at all, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Paul. Sorry, I can't hear people clapping. I'm sure they're clapping in the room, and I apologize for interrupting that. I want to turn next to Rabbi Jason Weiner for a few comments on your presentation, and then we'll turn to Dr. Jeremy Lazarus, and then we will get to audience questions shortly after that. Jason?
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm a huge fan of Professor Root Wolpe's, and I think everyone can see why. And I just found his presentation to be brilliant, articulate, and from my perspective, very accurate and a great presentation of some really important issues. Two thoughts as in reaction, and maybe not to add, but to just add a layer to some of the discussion. One of the things that Professor Root Wolpe brought up about the incongruity seemingly between the restrictive approach to permissibility of abortion amongst the rabbinic tradition, yet there being a very high rate of desire for it to be legal amongst Jews in surveys. Perhaps this is a reflection of something that Professor Root Wolpe mentioned in the outset of his remarks about the history of the Jewish experience and what it means to be a minority religion in a culture where when religion is enforced, it's usually not good for Jews. And when people are forced to make decisions based on another religion, it's been very damaging for Jews. And since Judaism allows abortion in many cases, there's a desire for a broad distinction between church and state. And what's fascinating, I just wanted to point out, was that interestingly, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who Professor Root Wolpe correctly pointed out as being the most extreme in terms of restricting abortion, in an interview with his son-in-law, Rabbi Dr. Moshe David Tendler, who was there with him authoring those responsa, actually said that Rabbi Feinstein, despite prohibiting abortion in many cases religiously, when asked what in his opinion the United States government should do in terms of Roe versus Wade and abortion, he thought it should be legal, which is fascinating. Even he, from a religious perspective, restricted abortion in many cases, but wanted it to be legal in the country, which is just fascinating. I think it really speaks to the historical precedent of the Jewish experience when religion is forced on Jews and it doesn't go well. And obviously the same should be for every people of every religion. Another point is fascinating discussion about the ventilator triage. And I think this is a good example of how Professor Root Wolpe mentioned this, that there's different sources that can be called upon. In my hospital, we were also very involved and really and unfortunately had to make decisions related to ventilator triage, and really in certain points had to start thinking practically about that. And when we think about the Jewish sources, the source about the ghosts is a fascinating one. We don't hasten the death of a ghost. I think we can add a layer to it, 2 layers to it, which we debated, which is that in addition to that source, which says that a ghost we can't hasten their death, the Code of Jewish Law, the Ramah, the Ashkenazi glosses on the classical Code of Jewish Law, writes that even though we can't hasten the death of a ghost, there's a distinction. One is that if there's a wood chopper outside of the house where the ghost is laying, the dying patient is laying, and the wood chopper is chopping wood, and for some reason the sound of the wood chopping will not allow that person's soul to leave them. And the argument is that when a person's soul is ready to leave, it's actually painful to force it to stay in one's body. So when the soul won't leave and it's stuck in the body, the person's trying to die, but they can't die because of the noise, the Code of Jewish Law says we tell the wood chopper, stop chopping the wood. However, he says, in line with the source that was mentioned, we could not pick up this dying person and move them to another room because that action would hasten their death. So the question is, what's the difference between picking them up and moving them to another room and stopping the wood chopper? And is a ventilator more akin to telling the wood chopper, stop chopping, or to picking the person up and moving them? And this is a big debate, and many rabbis and different bioethicists have taken different sides, but it's a good way to start to make it practical. What do we mean when we can't hasten their death, but we can remove an impediment? And is the ventilator an impediment, especially if it's to save another life? And that brings us one last point that I'll bring up, because this was a massive debate during these triage discussions, and it's related to the source that Professor Root Wolpe mentioned, which is that there's a really interesting source which says the Talmud discussed someone called the Kohen Mishuach Melchama. This was the Kohen, the high priest, whose job was to inspire the troops in battle. And it says that what would happen if you had a case where you had to choose between saving the Kohen Mishuach Melchama, his life, or other people's lives. And it actually says in that instance, one should save this person's life because they are in a certain way responsible for so many other lives. People are depending on them to inspire them, to lead them, and therefore we save that person's life first, even though we are very reluctant to ever choose that one life is more valuable than another. But this became a big debate in these triage discussions when we started talking about, well, what would we do if doctors and nurses on the front lines get sick? We are asking them to risk their lives to treat COVID patients. Are we also going to save them first? And what if we don't? Will we have a resource, a problem of having enough resources? The state of Israel debated this, and they decided that it would be unethical from a Jewish perspective ever to give anyone any precedent, except for the one case of medical professionals who need to be saved in order to maintain the ability to have personnel. So in our hospital, we decided not to give precedent to anyone. We said all life must be treated equally, but there were hospitals who decided, you know what, we should give certain people who will help us in the battle against COVID. Maybe we should give them precedent. So this just shows that, you know, these layers, Professor Root Wolpe started off the conversation with a fascinating source about not hastening the death of a dying patient. But I wanted to just share these other sources to show that the nuance gets further and further and further about, you know, how do you define a ventilator and whose life is more important? And these questions sometimes can be very practical as well. And so hopefully it adds to the brilliant presentation that Professor Root Wolpe gave us.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jason. And Jerry, I'll turn to you now for some additional comments.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Dr. Wolpe. You know, I confess that as you were talking, I was thinking about how much my own Jewish background, I am Jewish, how much that influenced what I do now and what I do on AMA's Council on Ethical and Judicial Affairs. And the simple answer to that is I don't know. I really don't know. I'm going to parallel some of what you talked about at the beginning because you know, the AMA Code of Medical Ethics is based on Thomas Percival's early code in the early 1800s, and 50% of the two people that wrote that code were Jewish. Isaac Hayes was Jewish. How much that influenced what he did, I have no idea, and we need to research that more. But for those of you who don't know, the AMA Code has been around since 1847. It's had many, many iterations, the latest being in 2017. And that code, the principles of that code are from the AMA House of Delegates, which are early on in 1847, it was all state medical societies. Now it's state and specialty societies. So it's the AMA House of Delegates, which is about 1,000 physicians and medical students that actually write the principles. And then we have our CJA, the council, which actually brings other opinions to the House of Delegates. This is all based on things that are happening in medicine now, things that physicians are concerned about clinically, they have questions about these things, and then our council brings this to the AMA House of Delegates. That House of Delegates is composed of all religions, many different cultural backgrounds. So it's a filtering process that gets eventually to the opinions that the council gives. So it's a different kind of mechanism of getting there. Sometimes we use bioethical principles, sometimes we use case examples, we argue a lot, It turns out that probably a majority of the council has been Jewish. Whether that makes a difference or not, I don't know. They've been Catholic. We've had vigorous discussions, especially around issues of end-of-life issues, physician aid in dying, physician-assisted suicide, abortion, and so on. I think one area that I think I just wanted to highlight is that the code and really the way our opinions are organized, it really puts the patient front and center, because the ethics are primarily for the benefit of the patient and the relationship of the patient to the physician making those decisions. So we have a code, and there are shalls in the, in the principles, but then there's a lot of opinions where there is a lot of wiggle room in terms of making those decisions. Your example about abortion, let me just talk about that very, very briefly, because the AMA code and the opinions of the AMA council had a great deal to do with why the AMA was one of the principal plaintiffs in the case before the Supreme Court in the Dobbs case. So we use the AMA code, which really has to do with recognizing that we, the AMA, thinks that decisions about abortion, reproductive rights, and so on should be between a patient and their physician. And that's where it ought to end. The government should not have an influence in that decision. And so the degree to which halachic law or any other kind of religious law influences that, it influences that from in an unspoken way, in an indirect kind of way. So Matt, I think I'll stop there, and then we can have time for some questions. Paul, I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Just want to make two quick comments. First, to the rabbi's wonderful comments. The reason I gave, first of all, the reason I gave the example of abortion was not to engage the Jewish debate. There's so much more nuance to it, but to try to point something out. Despite the fact that what the rabbi said is absolutely true, Rabbi Feinstein did say it should be legal, and certainly that skewing that you saw was because a lot of Jews wanted to be legal because, for the very reasons the rabbi said, to prevent coercive law over Jewish thought. But it is also true that Jews are the most liberal on abortion of any religious group, separate from the question of whether it should be legal or illegal. So just want to point that out. The other thing about whether healthcare workers should come first, every single group had that conversation. And one of the things that was part of that conversation, in many conversations, I'm sure here as well, was why just healthcare workers? What about the workers that clean the rooms after COVID patients die? They're risking their health too. What about the grocery? We all realized how important grocery clerks were during COVID, right? They had to go to work if we were going to eat, right? Should they get priority? So this question of nuance and layering came into both of those kinds of conversations. So and one last thing about the Code of Ethics. I'm from Philadelphia. That's where I grew up. That code in 1847 was first read on the steps of the Museum of Natural History in Philadelphia. So when we had the 150th anniversary of that code in 97, we had a whole big program there. I contributed a chapter to the book that Matt and my colleague Robert Baker wrote on the history of the AMA code. So that code has really, there were many codes before it. And by the way, one of the most influential historical codes for Jews and non-Jews is the Code of Maimonides. It's one of the most important medical codes ever written. But the AMA code has been profoundly influential internationally as a model code of ethics. Just wanted to point that out too.
Thank you for crediting me for something I had virtually nothing to do with, Paul. That book was Bob Baker, Linda Emanuel, Steve Latham. Jerry was involved in that program as well. I was there, but I can't. I wish I could take credit for the American medical ethics revolution. It's an astonishing book, and as you said, the code itself and that recounting of the story of the code has been very influential. I do want to follow with one of the questions we got from Sonia Flores here, because I think you've already started this conversation about there is undoubtedly some percent of Jewish people who might see abortion as prohibited in many cases by their religion, but they still wouldn't want to impose their views on others. And in fact, I think, Paul, at the very beginning of your presentation, you said Jewish law not only applies only to Jews, but it applies only to the Jews who choose to accept it. And so that very limited sort of recognition of the very limited applicability of Jewish law, or in its authoritative applicability to people. And so the question Sonia asked is, when we're navigating these issues in the clinical environment, what happens if, a provider is not Jewish, but the family is Jewish and wants the provider to do something that the provider thinks is really not warranted medically? And I know these cases have arisen in New York and New Jersey and elsewhere. How do we navigate those tensions within the healthcare environment when there are both Jewish and non-Jewish people? You could take Sonia's question and flip it the other way. So just any comment on how we navigate those in the healthcare environment?
Yeah, I am not a clinician, and I've always been worried about what we ask of clinicians outside of their clinical skills. So we ask clinicians to be culture brokers and anthropologists. We ask them to be sexologists and psychiatrists, even if they're not psychiatrists. We say physicians need to have all of these competencies to be good physicians. And it worries me, because what we really need to do is we need to rely on allied health professionals to fill in those places where it's wrong for us to ask physicians to be experts. One of those, for example, is in religious life. Because if you're going to be an expert in religious life, you have to be an expert in the 50, 100, 1,000, who knows, religions that are in your community. It's not just Jews. When a Mormon walks in, when a Jehovah's Witness walks in, when a Seventh-day Adventist walks in, whoever walks in, you're supposed to be an expert in all their religions and know how they feel. No, it's about talking to people and then bringing in the chaplain or that person's religious spokesman so that there can be a real conversation. And I think one of the problems that we often have is that the medical system doesn't always allow us the time or the resources to have the kind of conversations we should be having. And then it falls on the physician to try to cope with that and manage that. And we shouldn't be asking physicians always to do that. We're asking too much sometimes of our physicians. Last thing I'll say about this is, when that conversation does end up happening, and when you find an incompatibility between what the physician thinks is in the best interest of patient or what the physicians think, remember, physicians are also moral agents and have a right to bring their moral competence and perspective to their work. We want them to. And if those two things clash in a way that makes it impossible for this physician and that patient to come to an agreement about that patient's care, the obligation of the physician is to refer that patient out to another practitioner. We ask that of physicians that are pro-life. When a woman comes wanting an abortion, their obligation is to refer that patient out to another physician who can help them with the medical care they need. And that's what we ask of physicians. They don't, it doesn't always happen, but that's what we ask of physicians. That's what we should be asking of physicians here as well.
Let me just add a bit of nuance to that. And that is one of the principles of the AMA code is that physicians should have the right to choose whom to serve as long as they are not doing that in a discriminatory way. Actually, if someone has, on the basis of their conscience as a moral agent, does not want to refer, actually, we don't require them to refer either, just to give impartial information. So we go that far. The other thing in the AMA opinions is we have what's called a conscience code. So if a physician has a particular area of conscience, whether it's physician-assisted suicide, abortion, we say that they have a right to not do that or to do it based on their own particular moral views on that. And that became very complex around physician-assisted suicide, the same with abortion.
I wonder, just to continue on that strand for just a moment, and maybe I'll turn to Jason for this. Any thoughts on the concept of complicity in the Jewish discussion around both abortion and assisted dying, where I think the main challenges have been where the individual with strong religious beliefs refuses even to make a referral to someone else because they feel that would make them complicit. Is that concept of complicity, which we've seen a lot, from sort of the religious right, is there a version of complicity that's also in the Jewish tradition and that we ought to be aware of?
There is a version of it in the Jewish tradition, but differently. So that in the Jewish tradition, the verse that the rabbis argue is the primary verse that we turn to in this regard of complicity is called Lifnei Iver Lo Titein Michshol. You cannot put a stumbling block before the blind. And they felt that it's not a literally blind person. It means someone who's blind in that matter, that you're causing them to do something that goes against your religious values. What's fascinating about it, though, is that the rabbis of the Talmud limited that verse, which says, don't put a stumbling block before the blind, to a case where the example they gave was, let's say there's a river, and there's a person who can't drink any wine, and there's wine on the other side of the river, so they couldn't get it on their own. For you, but you have, let's say, a raft or some way of retrieving it and bringing it to them. For you to bring it to them would violate that verse of Lifnei Iver, of don't put a stumbling block before the blind. However, if that bottle of wine was just right next to them and they just didn't want to feel like reaching down, let's say they asked you for a favor, but they could easily get it themselves too. In those cases, it does not violate the prohibition because they could have done it on their own. So the discussion becomes very different in the Jewish community when you start asking, well, if you don't do it, then what will happen? And if you don't do it, someone else will do it anyways. It doesn't fall in the same category of prohibition. In fact, so much so that when physician aid in dying became legal here in California, we brought out a great rabbinic expert. He's the rabbi of Shari Tzedek Medical Center, a Hasidic rabbi. His name is Rabbi Usher Weiss. And we asked for guidance, from a religious perspective. What are we going to do? What is an Orthodox, for example, and this was the question, doctor going to do when physician aid in dying is legal now, it is in California, and their patient asks for it, and that doctor doesn't feel comfortable making the prescription. So we assumed he was just going to say, obviously you have to avoid it at all costs to run from the room. And he said, not only do I think you can be involved with it, I think you probably should. And everyone was shocked. He said, well, first of all, if you don't do it, someone else will. So it's not like you're going to prevent them from doing it. And second of all, maybe if you have some ethical concerns about it and you can have a conversation, not that your role is necessarily to force them what they're going to do or not going to do, but maybe it's good for them to have a conversation with someone who has some concerns and make you think about it a little bit. Instead of someone who maybe, let's say, is going to think like, okay, that's great, you want to do it, it's no problem. There's a value in having that conversation with people of differing perspectives, of having moral diversity. So even though there is the concept of complicity in that way of don't put a stumbling block before the blind, there's a lot more wiggle room, so to speak, since we recognize the concept of people's ability to do it anyways. Therefore, that changes the whole way we conceptualize the matter.
Which is a kind of beautiful synopsis of how Jews think, right? You have this principle: before a blind person, you don't put a stumbling block. It seems to answer all the questions. But then, of course, there are countervailing values. And once you bring them in, it becomes complex. And then you have to think about how do we weight these competing values, these many values, the value of complicity, not being complicit, the value of persuasion, the value of turning someone down who's going to go somewhere else and do something. So what are you really accomplishing? All of these values together have to each be weighed, thought through, looked at as a value in themselves, and then you come to a conclusion based on that. The importance of that is that doing that over and over and over and over and over again, whether you're doing it as an ethicist or a rabbi, or whether you're doing it for thousands of years as a people, in my view, instills in you a way of thinking and a way of regarding things that I believe does show up in the AMA code, because Jews were involved in helping to write it. And I guarantee does show up in your clinical work, whether you are conscious of it or not, because it's part of the Jewish way of thinking about and considering issues.
I wonder, Jerry, Marcella Schieffelin has put in a question about what happens when the religious prescription might conflict with the code of ethics? And can you think of examples where that has happened, and what guidance might you provide when you see a conflict between your responsibility as a physician who has to uphold our code of ethics, and your responsibility to however you perceive your religious responsibilities?
Well, I think if there was such a conflict, it should be resolved to favor the patient. So you'd have to do whatever you thought was in the benefit for the benefit of the patient. So in that case, as Paul talked about before, if I, from a religious point of view, felt that I couldn't do some particular kind of procedure or do some intervention, then I would refer to someone who would be willing to do that. But I wouldn't feel obligated to do that myself unless it was an emergency. Then I would be obligated to do that.
I want to ask a question. Or is there a question in the audience?
Yes, there's a question in the room, so I'll.
Okay,
I'll
I've got dozens of them here, but let's do one from the audience.
Okay, just speak loudly, please. So the question was, the person asking had written a paper on coercion in pediatrics, and the question of how we think about coercing pediatric patients to have, or in some cases, by the way, where parents refuse to have treatments that the medical system believes are in the best interest of the patient. So there's both the question of, do we coerce families or patients themselves, pediatric patients, to get procedures that are in the best interest of patients? And what do we do when we deeply believe that a patient needs a procedure and the parents are opposed to it? So I'll start us off. I mean, I'm sure everybody on this call has something to say about this. The ideas about this have changed over time. So, maybe 50 years ago, it was very clear that parental consent was the end of the conversation pretty much, right? And children were then, in general, they did, in whatever way you needed to do, you coerced them into getting the treatment the parents decided. I've seen over the course of my own career, so over the last 40 years or so, a movement more and more towards empowering children, especially as they get older. So we treat a 3-year-old very differently than we treat a 17-year-old. But insofar as they have agency and develop agency, we try to give them, first of all, assent, as it was called. That is, they don't have the legal power of consent, but we try to get assent. And when there isn't assent from the child, then we have a situation that gets managed in many different kinds of ways. And there also has been movement in the other direction, legally especially, of parents who refuse to give treatments for children that the state believes are obligatory, and parents then are often forced to allow the child to get that, and in some cases have been arrested, especially if they spirit the child away, or in cases, the very recent one where the child died because of the parents withholding care that they believed, they believed that what they were doing with their child was the right thing to do, but it involved not allowing that child to get care that the medical system and the state believed they should get, and that those parents were arrested and charged with murder. So this has always been a very difficult and complicated issue. If you want to read the most beautiful book on this that you will ever read Ann Fadiman's The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. It's a beautifully written book by a journalist. about a case in Fresno, California of a Hmong Vietnamese child who had epilepsy. And when she had epilepsy, she would see visions. And to her community, this was a divinely inspired set of visions that were valuable to the community. And so they didn't want her visions to stop. They were willing to try to work with the medical community to stop the violent shaking, but the visions were considered to be divine. While the medical community saw the parents as engaged in child abuse by not controlling these epileptic seizures the child has. And she examines this beautifully from all different perspectives. And I will only say it all turns out very badly. But that's the complexity of these kinds of cases.
Well, I just wanted to add, and maybe Rabbi Weiner has something to say about this also. So if it's from a Jewish perspective, and if it's a religious Jew, you might try to aim towards getting consultation from the rabbi or the family's rabbi to try to get you to a place where you'd all agree.
I just want to add one thing. I have seen many cases in my career where patients claimed their religion claimed something. And then when you brought in the religious representative, they said, no, that's not what our religion says at all. And these people have changed their mind. So it's really important to get in someone they respect, right? That's really important. Someone they respect from their religious perspective.
I wonder if I could ask, and maybe I'll turn to Rabbi Weiner for this. Any thoughts on the concept of double effect in Judaism? This is a Catholic concept, but it's become pretty widely discussed in the bioethics world. And it is sometimes a way that people work their way through, if you are giving the ventilator to the person who can survive, that's not quite the same as taking it away from the person who might die, but that death is not your intention. Your intention is to save this other life. So those kinds of, what does the intent of your action matter within the Jewish sort of way of thinking?
Yeah, in some cases it does. One of the areas where double effect became prominently emphasized in Jewish bioethics was when hospice and palliative care were new. And there was a great rabbi at that time named Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who was asked many of these questions in Israel. And some rabbis were concerned about, providing morphine for dying patients. They thought this might hasten death. On the other hand, these patients were suffering in a lot of pain, and they felt that it was cruel not to provide pain medications. And Rabbi Auerbach said, as long as the goal is to treat their pain, and it's not certain without a doubt that they will die from this medication, then even if, as a side effect, it might cause them to die sooner, he argued, that, and with the exact same kind of reasoning, since the goal is relieving pain, and that's a mitzvah. He actually argued it's a commandment of the love your neighbor as yourself. There's a fascinating application of that verse, that therefore one should provide pain medication, even though there could be these side effects, and that's an example of double effect being utilized in classical Jewish bioethics.
Yeah, and in Catholic thought, that was the case that brought double effect into conversation. Catholicism is very opposed to euthanasia or hastening death. So the conversation arose around giving morphine to patients and hastening death. So that really is sort of the archetypal question of double effect. But double effect happens all the time. The perfect example of double effect that is so basic to all of medicine, we always say, the Hippocratic idea is do no harm. But to remove my appendix, you have to slice open my belly. So are you doing harm? So we then have to, so the double effect was there from the very beginning. The intention there is not to hurt me by cutting my belly. The intention there is to take out my appendix. But the only way to do that is to cut through my belly. And so there's a double effect there, but it's always been there in medicine, but it's only recently that we framed it in those terms. And they're actually very helpful terms to think even about something as basic as surgery or medicines that have side effects or anything. I mean, physicians cause proximate harm all the time to cure longer term greater harms. That's part of what medicine so often is. And so that double effect issue is there, pervades all of medicine.
Paul, I wonder, can you continue on? We've got another question in the chat about a sort of classic bioethics issue, which is the distinction or lack thereof between withholding care and withdrawing a service. How might a Jewish bioethicist approach that?
So this is a really interesting one because this was a distinction that was very clear in bioethics in its early days, that there was a difference between so there are three categories of this. Not doing something. So not engaging in an action will have consequences for the other person. Maybe it'll cause their death, right? You don't help them, they fall on the tracks, you don't pull them off. You say, I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't push them on the tracks. I just came across, I just decided not to do anything. Do you have moral culpability because you didn't engage in an act which could have helped them? So there's non-action. Then there's withdrawal of something. And then there is application of something. So you have so to give you the three examples, you have a dying patient. A, you could do something to make it so they don't die. Are you morally culpable if you don't do that? Two, the wood chopper example. They're dying. The only thing keeping them from dying is the wood chopper. Can you stop the wood chopper? Can you withdraw something or deny something that would cause death? And the third is active euthanasia. You assist in their dying. And these categories are complex and have been talked about a lot. In philosophical bioethics, over the last 30 years or so, there has been a recognition or an argument that that not acting is an action, right? That it has moral import, so that you can't differentiate not acting and acting philosophically. But Judaism has always kept that distinction, and it has kept the distinction between withdrawing care versus or denying, withdrawing an impediment to death, which the rabbi talked about, versus actively causing death. One is not allowed and one is allowed. So these categories have remained very important in Jewish thought, even as I've watched them get less important as categories in philosophical bioethical thought. And I think part of the reason for that is because Judaism is a very pragmatic religion. Judaism doesn't engage in a lot of deep philosophical insight to come to conclusions that it then thinks of as pervasive. To Jewish ways of thinking, they're always it's casuistic. They're always grounded in particular cases, and they always have to have, in the end, some action in the real world. Judaism isn't a theoretical religion for the most part. That doesn't mean there aren't theological conversations and philosophy. They happen all the time. But when we get down to tachlis, when we get down to where the rubber hits the road, it's never about philosophical concepts. It's about tying in moral human action based on thinking about the principles of Judaism and how they apply to human moral action. So it has been very helpful in Judaism to keep those categories and debate those categories and massage and nuance those categories, rather than suggest that philosophically they are undifferentiated.
If I could just ask you, Paul, when I think about this from a clinical point of view, I think about the physician who does not want to engage in care that they consider to be futile, and try to convince usually the family about not continuing with some kind of treatment. Is that part of the Jewish bioethics?
So the rabbi may be able to talk about this in terms of sort of the halakha conversation about this better than I can, but I will say, yes, it is very clear in my view. So when the futility conversation came in, the question was, the interesting thing was it was spurred on not by medical or philosophical, but by economic questions. That is, you have a dying patient, and we began to get to the point where managed care was saying, what kinds of things are we doing at the end of life that we shouldn't be doing? And that began the conversation, do we sometimes give patients care that's futile. It doesn't really do anything, but we're throwing it all at them because we have the resources once upon a time, and might as well give them everything. And so, and as care got more and more expensive and more sophisticated, it became more and more important to try to differentiate what really helps and what really doesn't help. But then all the nuance started coming in. Okay, so you have a person towards the end of life, and the question is, will this medical care do what? Prolong their life? What if they don't want their life prolonged? Make them feel better, but not prolong their life? Well, that's good. But should we cure this infection that will probably eventually kill them, but actually not curing the infection, they're still going to die? Will it add time? We're not sure. Is that a futile? So what do we mean by futility? And futility means something that, it doesn't mean something that doesn't keep the patient alive longer. It means something that doesn't achieve the goals we want to achieve for that patient, which may not be to keep the patient alive longer. That may not be the goal here. The goal may be to keep the patient comfortable, right? So it got very nuanced very quickly, as all these complex ideas do. And so the Jewish conversation, just like the medical conversation, just like the Christian conversation, began to try to understand the nature of these nuances. But I think there is general agreement that there's no moral compulsion to give care that's futile. It's a waste of resources, which itself is a value that is important. And that those resources can be a bed, they can be a substance, they can be physician time, right? Those are all resources that can get used inappropriately in the case of treating something that shouldn't, for whatever reason, be treated. So I think there's wide agreement across. The problem, of course, often is the patient and their family, who want, quote unquote, everything done without really understanding what that even means. But the decision of a physician not to do something is not seen as a rational decision for a futile treatment, but is seen as withholding care from my mother. So it really, futility to me is really a communicative problem more than it's an ethical problem.
So go ahead, Rabbi Weiner, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And then unfortunately, we're getting close to the end. So I have a final question that I'll just ask each of you to reflect on.
Sure. So I'll be brief then. Just, you will find some kind of extremes within the rabbinic community. Like, so, for example, the Rabbi J.D. Blythe, one of the experts, but someone who has, certain views on these matters, who argues that futility is, an inappropriate concept because, what might be seen as futile to some, is in respecting the patient's values. There's a value in prolonging every second of life, and every second has value, and that's therefore not futile. So you sometimes hear that, but the classic source that is the reason the mainstream view is, like Professor Root Wolpe said, that we recognize futility within rabbinic literature is the story of the death of Rabbi Yehuda HaNassi, the great rabbi who authored the Mishnah. Just very, very briefly, when he was dying, there was a woman who lived in his home with him, his assistant, and her and all of the students gathered around his house to pray for him to recover. But she was inside the house and she saw how much he was suffering. And she realized prolonging his life is not in his benefit right now. So she stopped praying for him to recover. And she said, God, I think you need to take him because clearly it's time for him to go. He's suffering, but his students' prayers are keeping him alive. So he wouldn't die. So she went to the rooftop, and where they couldn't see her, she smashed a jug down to the ground, and it startled them. So they would stop praying. And when they stopped praying, he died. His soul left. And that was seen by the rabbis in later generations as proof that there was such a concept that sometimes it's not in our best interest to prolong life. Even if we can do it, it's not necessarily the right thing to do. And I'll just add one last brief point, because it just was mentioned by Dr. Root Wolpe, what I thought was really interesting was that, of course, as the bioethics community has removed much of the distinction between withholding and withdrawing and tried to argue that it's not a philosophically appropriate concept, that it's to distinguish. And as the rabbinic community has sometimes maintained this distinction between withholding and withdrawing, just a fascinating point during the pandemic, one of the things we saw with these triage conversations was that as we began to come up with these triage priority rules, we started hearing from many, many nurses and respiratory therapists that it might be nice, you might be able to justify withdrawing in life-sustaining interventions to save someone else's life. But this is causing us moral distress to be asked to withdraw a life support from someone who we otherwise would not be withdrawing life support because we are deciding that someone else's life is more valuable. And even if you can justify it philosophically, experientially, it's very, very challenging. So it's also an interesting layer in that conversation.
Thank you so much. I realize I would like to give Dr. Helen Morris, who is the sponsor for this program today, an opportunity to either ask a question or make a closing statement. We just have a couple minutes left, and I definitely don't want to close the program without giving Helen a chance to reflect on what she's heard today.
Well, my only comment is to thank our speakers. I think this was a very, very interesting discussion and one that I learned a lot from. And so I'm very thankful to you for coming, and also the other speakers as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. And I'll just, I'll reiterate that. Thank you all so much. This has been an extraordinary, enlightening conversation, one that I hope we'll get a chance to continue with future presentations on various aspects of the ways in which the Jewish community and Jewish bioethicists have influenced the larger bioethics community. Thank you for coming and joining us today, and we'll look forward to seeing you all at our next presentation.